Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar, CMMC 2.0, What's Changed and How to Prepare. I am Leslie Crowley, an account manager at Winvale, and I'm pleased to introduce Heather Engel, Director of Strategic Security at Trac. She will discuss the changes made to CMMC 2.0, timelines for certification, your security strategy, and simplifying the compliance measures surrounding NIST 800-171 cybersecurity controls that are required by DFARS. A little bit about our speaker before we start. Heather has 20+ years of cybersecurity and compliance experience with the DoD and supporting the DIB. She holds industry certifications including CISSP, CISM, and CISA, and is a recognized subject matter expert in NIST frameworks, FAR and DFARS, cybersecurity requirements, FedMore, and more. Lastly, if you're new to Winvale, we are a leading contract consulting firm and have advised thousands of companies of all sizes and industries with their GSA schedule contracts, from new GSA schedule offers to post-award maintenance and compliance support. During the presentation, feel free to submit your questions in the questions section of your webinar controls, and we will devote some time at the end to address as many questions as we can. We are recording this webinar for later viewing and your reference. I will now pass it over to Heather.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. And Leslie, thank you very much for the introduction. As Leslie mentioned, I'm Heather Engel with Trac. I'm the Director of Strategic Security there. And what we're going to talk about today are some of the things that have happened over the last 6 months with the cybersecurity industry, with some of these clauses that impact you as you are working and pursuing different opportunities with.
Heather, I think we lost your sound.
How about now?
You're back. Great, thank you.
Okay, I must have hit a button. As I was saying, the first thing that I would tell you for this webinar, if you don't take away anything else, it is to get your information from the source. So the website here is the Acquisition and Sustainment Community, where they will talk with where you're going to get the correct information. I'm not sure how much of what I said earlier you heard, but when I did research for this webinar, it was pages and pages of search results before I was able to get to this official site. So write it down, put it into your web browser. This is where you're going to go to find information. This is also where you're going to go to find some of the documentation and things that we'll talk about today. So back in November of 2021, major changes to the CMMC model were announced. And so up until now, the DoD had been pursuing CMMC version 1. And version 1.0 included some additional controls. It had a lot of maturity model process requirements. And so this was a pretty big announcement. A lot has changed, and we'll go through those. The primary thing is the DoD opted to streamline the model. And so we had 20 additional controls or practices. Those went away. The second goal was to reduce the assessment costs. This was a big area of concern from the defense contracting community, and the DoD really made the point that they heard the feedback and that they were listening to the feedback about how to make this more cost effective for the DIB community. The third thing was to go back to a more flexible implementation strategy, and we'll talk a little bit about that as far as what that means from an interpretation perspective for the controls. We also, over the last couple of months, have gotten some new guidance. One of the things that the community has been waiting on is the scoping guidance. And this is something that I would encourage you to read. And I'll say this a number of times throughout this webinar today. Understanding and implementing compliance measures under this model really relies on a good understanding of your data. So where your data lives, how it's coming into your organization, what happens to it once it's there, and then where it's going when you're sending it out, whether it's back to the government or whether it's going to subcontractors or primes. Understanding the data is really key, and being able to effectively apply these controls, you really need to have a good understanding of what assets are going to be considered in scope versus out of scope. So now we have the guidance to do that. I would encourage you, if you are starting a CMMC project or even if you have already started working on implementing NIST 800-171 controls, I would encourage you to go back and look at the scoping guidance, because it's going to help you categorize your assets, whether or not those assets are processing or are intended to process controlled unclassified information. Another key takeaway here is that the current CMMC efforts within the DoD are suspended while the rulemaking process is ongoing. Now, what does that mean for you? Does this mean that you have, a couple years to just kick back and wait while the DoD does their thing? Well, not really. That's what we're going to talk about here on the next slide. But again, as I mentioned, if you don't take away anything else from this slide, it's to get your information from the source. We appreciate you joining us for this webinar today. I probably get an email at least 2 or 3 times a week inviting me to a webinar very similar to this one. So we're happy you're here and that you've joined us with WinVeil and Cuick. All right, so our next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the old model versus the new model. So under the old model, which was version 1.0, we had 5 levels. Now under model 2.0, we have 3 levels. So if previously you were going to pursue a level 3 certification, which is what the majority of our clients are looking for, that's where you need to be if you're handling controlled unclassified information, or CUI. If that's the level that you are intending to pursue, you'll notice on the left-hand side of the slide, you had 130 practices that were technical in nature for implementation, some of them policy and process related. Now we've gone back down to 110, and we've aligned those practices back with the NIST SP 800-171. So that's our NIST Special Publication 800-171. And this is what defense contractors have been working with essentially since 2015, maybe 2016. 800-171 has been around for a long time, and it's been a contract clause under the DFARS 252.204-7012 since that time. So this is something that should hopefully be familiar, and hopefully this is on your radar. So the good news is, if you are already working hard towards complying with 800-171, now those additional 20 practices have gone away. The process requirements were also removed from CMMC version 2.0. And so what this means for you is there's less documentation that's going to be required. When we look at the different implementations, obviously, we want to be able to still show that we're pursuing security maturity. We want to be able to get out of the reactive mode that a lot of IT departments find themselves in and into a more proactive or comprehensive security strategy. But you don't need to create a lot of documentation just for the sake of creating documentation under the new model. Let's talk a little bit about level 1. Level 1 is the level that you would pursue if you only have federal contract information and you don't have controlled unclassified information. And this applies to a lot of companies in the DIB, so I don't want to gloss over the idea that you might need to pursue level 1. These are foundational controls. There's 17 practices. This one did not change between CMMC version 1.0 and 2.0. And again, you'll be able to most likely perform a self-assessment under level 1. Now, one of the things that has changed is under level 2, previously level 3, the defense contracting community was told that you were going to have to hire a third party to come in and perform those assessments on your behalf. The new guidance is that some companies operating at level 2, which means you have controlled unclassified information, will be able to still conduct a self-assessment. Now, does that mean that you're not going to be assessed by anyone? Absolutely not. We're seeing a lot in the industry, or a lot of pressure questionnaires coming from the primes down asking where you are with NIST 800-171. And of course, there's always DIBCAC and DCMA audits. That was discussed in a lot of detail on the CMMC accreditation board or accreditation body town hall last night. We'll cover a little bit of that information here in just a second. Level 3, again, under the CMMC 2.0 model, that corresponds to the old level 5. Level 2 and 4 were never really intended to be levels that you would certify at. They were transitional levels. So we were moving from level 1, which would be basic, into an intermediate to as a step to your way to level 3. And so those have been removed just for simplicity and clarity under the new model. So let's talk about some timelines. What does this mean? I mentioned that this doesn't mean that you get to just kick back for the next year and not do anything for a number of reasons. The government has stated that they require 9 to 24 months to complete the rulemaking process. That's just the government way of doing things. They've got to move through the process. There needs to be comments from industry, and then they need to adjudicate all of those comments. So the rulemaking process started approximately in January of this year. So that means that we could see information back on this as soon as September, or it could be as long as more towards the end of 2023. We just don't know, and a lot of that depends on how much feedback comes in from industry. Incidentally, one of the things that was mentioned last night, if you are interested in providing feedback on the rulemaking process on CMMC 2.0 and the implementation strategy, you are able to do that through the official website, which I believe the link is the same one that I put up when I told you to get your information from the source. So if you're interested in doing that, you're encouraged to go through the mechanisms that the government has set up to do that, not to just email feedback to government personnel that you may happen to have their emails for one reason or another. So remember, clause 252.204-7021 is the clause that's going to require the implementation of CMMC. We are not seeing that clause, and we will not see that clause implemented in contracts until the rulemaking process is complete. We do still have, and we've always had, 7012, which requires the implementation of NIST 800-171, as well as the implementation of an incident response strategy and a couple of other things, mostly having to do with cloud service providers. The DoD is exploring opportunities to provide incentives for contractors who will voluntarily obtain a CMMC certification in the interim period. Now, what does that mean? There have been a number of incentives discussed. Nothing is official at the moment, so that's something to keep an eye on. If you think that you're ready, if you've been doing a great job with NIST 800-171, you feel like you have your system security plan, it's in place, it's updated, you're performing an annual risk assessment, a tabletop exercise, you're doing all the things correctly, there may be some incentives coming for you to voluntarily get a CMMC certification prior to it actually being a clause or a requirement in one of your contracts. So keep an eye out for that information. I noticed one of the questions here is, can you please redisplay the info link for CMMC? We'll bring that up again at the end. It's the acquisition and sustainment community. So finally, when we talk about timelines, and we'll talk a little bit on the next slide about budgeting, one of the reasons that this change was made is to reduce assessment costs. This was a huge area of feedback from the DIB, and this allows all companies, or will allow all companies at level 1 and a subset of companies at level 2 to demonstrate compliance through self-assessments. We've already talked a little bit about this. So again, what does that mean? That means that if you, whether or not you're going to undergo a third-party assessment or whether you're going to do a self-assessment, you should be continuing to work on this now. If you're comfortable with your system security plan, if you're comfortable that you have maybe a couple of outstanding items on your POAM, but they're not 5-point or 3-point controls, then you're just working on maintaining, right? We're keeping an eye on and updating the documentation that we've created. We're making sure that the processes fit the business. But if you're not there yet, this is your chance to continue working on it before it becomes an emergency situation. All right, our next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about security strategy. And one of the things that we really wanted to communicate during this webinar is regardless of what's happening with CMMC, your security strategy has not changed that much. And one of the things that we always try to communicate to our clients is the clauses that you have now include these listed here, 7012, 7019, and 7020. You don't have a requirement for CMMC 2.0 at the moment. Now, with the new version of CMMC, it's very similar to what you're required to do under 7012. In fact, it's identical for the most part. However, 7019 and 7020 These are the clauses that require us to generate a score and put it into SPURS. This is the supplier procurement system. And so if you have those clauses, you're going to have a system security plan to generate your score, and you have to have a good understanding of how you prioritize controls. The scoring mechanism for 7019 includes a list of all the controls tied to a numerical value. Some controls are 5 points, some controls are 3, and some are 1-point controls. And so as you work to mature your processes, evaluating your risk tolerance and reviewing your security controls, one of the things that we want to look at is really targeting those 5-point controls first. The reason being is when the announcement for CMMC 2.0 was made, one of the things that was stated is that there is a process in place, or they're working on a process to allow waivers for specific controls, but more than likely, anything that's a 5-point control is not going to be something that is waiverable. So we're talking about things like multi-factor authentication, access control, boundary and firewall controls. These are things that are really critical to securing your infrastructure, not just protecting DoD information, but protecting your information. And so these are the 3 clauses that you have now. Your security strategy, regardless of what's happening with CMMC, is the same thing that it has been for the last at least 6 years. We're working towards full compliance with NIST 800-171. You'll notice the top bullet here. The cost of doing business with the DoD has changed dramatically in the last 10 years, regardless of whether your DoD revenue has increased or decreased. I had a client tell me one time that their DoD revenue had actually gone down in the last 5 years. And the question for them then is, does it remain worthwhile to continue doing business with the DoD? I think for most companies, the answer is probably yes. However, when you start to look at what things cost, and that's something that we'll talk about in later slides here, does it make sense to, one, continue to do business with the DoD? And if so, what's going to be the most cost-effective way for you to manage your data and for you to comply with these clauses? So again, we're continuing to work towards full compliance and a 110 for your SPURS score. 110 would be a perfect score. That means you've implemented all the controls, you've done your tabletop exercise, you've done a risk assessment, you've got multi-factor authentication across the organization, you have FIPS level encryption where it's needed to protect confidentiality of data. The lowest score that you can get is minus 203. Again, because the controls are not all worth 1 point, you can go in the negative very quickly. How do we plan now for the financial aspects of CMMC? Well, the government has said they are going to publish projected costs, just like they did under CMMC 1.0. The cost projections under CMMC 1.0 were published in the Federal Register about 1.5 years ago, and it broke down in a good amount of detail how much you could expect to spend both internally supporting a third-party assessment and how much you could expect to pay that third party to come in and perform the assessment for you. So from a budgeting perspective, what does this mean? We don't have a lot of information on whether or not you're going to be required to undergo a third-party assessment at the moment. We'll know more about that. But when you start to look at what you need to do to get to that 110 SPURS score, there's a number of things that go into that. There's internal resources, there's personnel, there's creating policy, there may be investing in tools or investing in solutions to help you layer on the various defenses that you're required to put in place here. So even though under CMMC 1.0, a strategic plan was required, it's not required under CMMC 2.0. It's generally just a good thing to have. So when you think about your security strategy, looking at your internal resources, what's the availability of your personnel to do this? And when you look at whether it makes sense to outsource it, whether it makes sense to keep it in-house, or whether it makes sense to go to some sort of solution that might be an enclave, those are some of the things that you have to look at. And you'll look at those in the context of risk management. So we'll deviate here and talk just a little bit about risk tolerance. When we look at how you apply these controls, how you interpret the controls, it's always going to be in the context of risk. And so understanding the data that you have, understanding what type of information, where it lives, who has access to it. All of those things are really key to understanding your risk level. Once you have evaluated your risk, you can then start to say, do we have an acceptable level of risk? Is this a level of risk that's tolerable, or do we need to put more things in place to reduce that risk down to an acceptable level? So when we shift now here from talking about security strategy into simplifying compliance, remember risk is a big part of that. And we don't just look at the cybersecurity risks. We look at risks to the business. We look at changes in the general situation. So we may see changes to compliance mandates, like we saw here. We may see different threat levels in the world, as we've seen some elevated threat levels just in the last month with some of the situation that's going on in the Ukraine. So when we talk about simplifying compliance, you have to understand your data flows. You have to know where your data lives. You have to know how it got there and where it's going to go in order to apply these technical controls. Enclave or managed solutions versus doing it yourself. This again is something that you'll look at based on the resources that you have within the context of understanding which poses a greater level of risk, maybe which one is more cost effective. One thing that we always talk with our clients about is whether you have outsourced or you have an in-house solution. One of the easiest ways to simplify your compliance is to look at each control and assign a responsibility for that control to either someone in the organization or to your managed service provider or to your enclave provider. And so we advise our clients to ask for this whenever you're considering a solution. If you're going to do it in-house, it makes sense to go down through the controls and say, this is going to be an HR responsibility. This is going to be the responsibility of our FSO if you have a facility security clearance. This is going to be the responsibility of IT. Another thing that can do is when you're trying to understand what type of solution might be best for you, that's going to really help you understand what the resources that are going to be required internally would be. When you look at a shared responsibility matrix under NIST 800-171, a lot of the controls can be met with technical configurations, but there are a lot that are going to require a policy or a process. There's a whole section on personnel management. There's another section on physical security that generally is not going to be a technical control. Those are going to be process controls. So that's another way to help simplify your compliance. Look at each control and without even spending a whole lot of time on that specific control, you can generally assign responsibility for it. When we look at some technical ways to start to secure your infrastructure, and these actually came from an incident response tabletop that I did with a client a few weeks ago. And the exercise scenario that we did had to do with ransomware. And one of the things that we looked at was, what are some of the new strains of ransomware that we've been seeing just in the last month to 6 weeks? And what are the things that you can do to dramatically decrease the risk that ransomware will take down your entire infrastructure? And these are the 3 things. So the first is controlling access with multi-factor authentication. I already mentioned this is a 5-point control under the NIST 800-171A. Controlling access with multi-factor authentication will go a long way in protecting your infrastructure. It's not perfect, nothing is. Obviously, you can have social engineering. There are ways that an attacker could get around multi-factor authentication, but having it in place makes it just that much harder. And it also provides more opportunity for any kind of an auditing or a security information and event management tool to identify that maybe something's going on here. The second thing is to isolate with segmentation. We already said we have to understand our data, we have to understand where that data lives, and we have to understand who needs access to it. And this is something that a lot of our clients are great at doing when it comes to financial data or human resources data. We understand intuitively, right, that personally identifiable information isn't something that the whole company should have access to. Maybe it's just human resources, or maybe it's our benefits service provider. But it's a little bit trickier when we start to look at controlled unclassified information and when we start to look at things like corporate confidential information. So the answer here is to isolate with segmentation. In the DoD, it's sometimes referred to as need to know, which means, do I need to have access to this information to do my job? And if the answer is no, we can do things like role-based access control, where we limit access to folders, or we limit access specifically to files. We can create separate segments for different types of information. So in some cases, we have clients who work with CUI and they have that CUI on a completely separate segment from the information that they use to run their business. Again, what will that do is if we're isolated effectively with logical controls or with physical controls, in the event of a ransomware attack or in the event of malware, it becomes more difficult to access everything within the information environment, and we have a better chance of stopping that malware before it spreads across the entire environment. Finally, the third thing, limiting remote access. So obviously we want to limit remote access as much as possible. When everybody started working remotely 2 years ago, this was something that a lot of companies struggled with. We had to keep employees online and able to do their jobs, but I think in the last 2 years, a lot of companies have started to implement more things to limit remote access, including the use of VPNs. If you're going to authenticate through the VPN, that VPN is secured with multi-factor authentication. But we really want to take a look at what type of traffic we're letting into the environment and how it gets there. And again, these are all controls that directly correspond to what you're going to have to do for NIST 800-171. So the last piece here in terms of simplifying our compliance, if you're way behind, spend a little bit of time creating the shared responsibility matrix, take a look at the critical 5-point controls and see where you are. See what needs to happen to start to implement and to start to make headway on securing the environment. Those 5-point controls are going to be the ones that are going to that have been identified in general, and they're going to do the most to improve your security and reduce your risk. So that's kind of the overview of CMMC 2.0. I can see we're getting a number of questions in here. So before we get to the questions, I want to take just a few minutes and tell you about the webinar part 2. So we have you signed up, or if you signed up for this webinar and registered, you're going to get access to part 2 of our webinar series, which is going to happen on April 20th. We'll do the same time. It's also a Wednesday. And during this webinar, we're going to do more of a technical solutions deep dive. So we're going to talk to you about what it means to understand your data. How do you identify and tag controlled unclassified information? What is FCI versus CUI? We'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to get your data flows down on paper. Then we'll talk a little bit more about the controls breakdown. So I covered those three standards on the previous slide, but we'll talk a little bit more about implementation and interpretation for all of the control families. So there's 14 control families. We'll hit on the most important ones and talk a little bit about how we interpret some of these things. There's a number of controls, and I hear this question all the time, which is, I just want this to tell me what to do. And as I mentioned, a lot of the controls you have to implement in accordance with your risk level. So you have to do the control, but it's not going to be prescriptive, it's descriptive. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that and how to handle it. Again, for this next webinar, we're really encouraging you to submit your questions ahead of time so that we can touch on anything that might be specific to technical questions, or if there are specific controls that you're really struggling with, we would love to talk with you about those. Some other things that we'll talk about are working with a managed service provider or a cloud service provider. This was something that was also discussed in depth on the CMMC town hall last night. The idea that a cloud service provider needs to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. We're going to cover what that means and what that means for you when you are looking to select an MSP or a cloud service provider. We'll talk a little bit more about what it takes to handle your compliance in-house. So does it make sense maybe to have some help building out upfront and then maintaining? Is that something you can do? What are some of the things that you need to think about? And then finally, we'll cover the idea of enclave solutions and whether that might be right for your business. So with that, we'll turn it to some questions. And I notice I have a number of questions down here in the chat. The first one that we'll cover here is how do you know, or how do we know if our company is at level 1, 2, or 3, and if level 2, whether we qualify for self-assessment? So this is a great question. For the majority of companies that are handling CUI, you're going to certify at level 2. And if you are going to certify at level 3, you will know that. You'll be told generally by the government, or if you're working on a contract or responding to an RFP, you will know that you'll need to certify at level 3. We don't have a lot of information about level 3 yet. We know that it's going to be at a minimum the 110 controls. There are going to be additional controls from NIST 800-172. And so that's where you want to look at. If you think that you're working on a contract where you have controlled and classified information, sometimes, in general, we're looking at space, weapon systems, things like that. Those are the types of things that we would expect to see require a level 3 assessment. Level 2 is going to be standard CUI, and CUI is everywhere. So that one is what's going to apply to the majority of companies on this call, I would suspect. Level 1 is federal contract information, as I mentioned. You will qualify for self-assessment under level 1. Level 2, it's going to be contract specific, so you're just not going to know. You're just not going to know until the rulemaking process is done and until we start to see this in contracts. One of the questions, another question, can you explain what NIST 800-171A is? Yes. So when you look at the body of policy and documentation related to both CMMC and the DFARS clauses, NIST 800-171A is the assessment guide. And so if you just look at the NIST 800-171 controls, they're going to give you just maybe 1 or 2 sentences about what you need to do. The assessment guide is going to break that down in a lot of detail, and it's going to give you more specific information about how to apply that control. Most of the controls in NIST 800-171 under 171A have anywhere from 2 to 5 or more subcontrols. And so if you have not explored what's in 800-171A yet, I would encourage you to do that. If we haven't, so here's another question. If we haven't started anything related to NIST 800-171, what should we do first? We covered that just a little bit. Obviously, the first thing is going to be about the data, understanding what data you have, what type of information, where that data lives. And that, again, is related to our prior question of how do we know what level to certify at? You have to understand and you have to look at the data that you have. Let's see, I heard that GSA FAS said they intended to push the CMMC compliance requirement down to the task order level. That's not something that I feel like I'm qualified to comment on. I'm not sure if anyone from Winvale has had that or heard that, but I have not heard that, so I'm going to leave that one there, and that'll be something that we'll keep an eye on, certainly for future webinars. Does or will CMMC 2.0 level 1 require a SPURS score? So this is a great question. As of right now, the requirement for a SPURS score is 252.204-7019, which requires you to put in a SPURS score, and 7020 requires you to allow the government access to review your system security plan should they request it. So it looks like the answer to that could potentially be no. However, we really won't know until the rulemaking process is complete, right? If you're going to have to put in a SPURS score. And when you put in your SPURS score, obviously there would need to be some updates to the SPURS system, I would think, if they were trying to accept scores under level 1. So we'll leave that one to answer as best we can at the moment, but I would suspect that the answer is going to be probably not, but if it is, there would need to be some updates made to the system. Let's see, another question we got is how much detail do we need in our system security plan? If you have not yet created a system security plan, NIST 800 TAC 88 gives you an example of a system security plan. There are also you can also download templates from the NIST website. So the same place that you would go to download NIST 800-171, there's an SSP template out there as well as a POAM. As far as the level of detail, this is going to vary pretty widely based on your infrastructure and based on the size of your organization. So for example, if you already have a pretty large environment or you're a larger company, you have a decent sized IT staff, you have a body of policy already, then your detail in your system security plan may be as simple as referencing policy that already exists. However, if you don't have anything, if you're starting from scratch, one of the things that you can do is you can write policy into your system security plan. You can also look at describing the infrastructure in a lot more detail. And again, the level of detail is really going to be tied back to 800-171A. You want to make sure that you're hitting all of those subcontrols and getting all of those markers documented. The purpose of the system security plan is to document the security of the system. And so if you can't show that through other documentation that you would then point to, then you're going to need to have a pretty high level of detail in the system security plan. Let's see, it sounds like no one will be allowed to have 5 or 3-point controls on their POAM. Is this still true? This is something where we're waiting for some more information on how this is going to be enacted. And what this is going to look like. I suspect we'll get some better answers on allowing specific controls or not allowing controls on a POAM. Probably around the same time we get some more information on some incentives for the DoD or from the DoD to the DIB to actually undergo a voluntary CMMC assessment before it's required. But we are hearing that there are going to be some controls that are not going to be waiverable. So if you have this control on your POAM, it can't just sit there forever. Specifically, multi-factor authentication is one of those, and I think I mentioned a few others having to do with segmentation and a few things like that. I think that answers pretty much all of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. Is there any others? Let's see, the one thing I will do is let's go back and I'll display that link again. So it's right here. Get your information from the source if you want to write that down or if you want to screenshot it. That's going to be the authoritative source, not only for information on CMMC, but also for all of these documents that we've referenced here. So the scoping guidance, you can get the CMMC assessment guidance for level 1 and level 2. The scoping guidance for level 1 and level 2 has been released. And there's a number of things on that site that it's worth spending some time there. Another thing that I would encourage you to look at, which we don't have the link in here because this was specifically about CMMC 2.0, but I would also encourage you to look at the DoD procurement toolbox. And you can Google DoD procurement toolbox, and that should be one of the first links that comes up. And what that one does is this is a set of frequently asked questions, and the DoD has been adding to it since 2015, and it's now very comprehensive. So when you're looking at the controls under NIST 800-171, if you have a question on something, there's a good chance that someone else had the same question and that the DoD has addressed it to some extent. Now, is it going to be perfect? Probably not. Will it answer what you're looking for or what specific problem you're trying to solve? Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but it gives you at least a little bit of insight into what the DoD intent is behind the implementation of that specific control. All right, so hopefully everyone's had enough time to write down that link there. We'll go back to our question slide. In closing, I think the takeaways here really are to remember that just because CMMC 2.0 is undergoing the rulemaking process, and it's going to be a little while before we see that clause in our contracts, you're still going to be contending with requests from your prime to not only know what's your SPURS score, can I see your SSP? You're also looking at potential DIBCAC assessments. you're contractually obligated, if you have the 7012 clause and the 7019 and 7020 clauses, to do these things. And so regardless of where we are with CMMC, you still have contractual requirements. The government still has remedies for contractual requirements, which I think is really important. You know, when we look at all of the DFARS clauses as a whole, you don't get to just not do some things because they're hard or because they take a long time or because they're expensive. You still have to implement them if that's in your contract and if you have signed that contract. And so those are really some of the takeaways that we want to really encourage you to do, you know, over the next several months as you work through this. Okay, so with that, I'll turn it back over to Leslie to close us out.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you all for joining our webinar. We will be sending out the recording and the slides in a follow-up email. So if you didn't catch that link, you'll get that in the slide. Since you've registered for this session, you'll get exclusive access to the second webinar that Heather mentioned on April 20th. Feel free to submit your technical questions prior to the webinar. We'll welcome the questions. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to contact me. Thank you so much, and hope you all have a great day.